regenerative agriculture has a huge movement behind it, but most people behind it, unfortunately, are not actually farmers. It's a lot of activists, which is great. I love having that momentum, but the problem is they get very, very into the weeds on a lot of this stuff.
You're listening to How I Grow This, exploring stories of gardeners from across the globe as we learn from their biggest tips and tricks to some of the things not to do. I'm your host, Luke Hammond. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the How I Grow This podcast. I am joined with a good friend of mine, Briana Bosch. You guys are in for a treat. Let me tell you this. You may have seen her from Blossom and Branch Farm on Instagram, pretty much everywhere on the internet. She's all over the place and she's incredible. Let me tell you that much. She's on YouTube, Instagram. She's running multiple farms right now in multiple states.
Yeah.
And she's like, is it fifth generation? Fifth generation? Are you Gen 5?
Yep.
Gen 5 farmer. Oh, man. Everyone, welcome Briana to the podcast.
Hey, Luke, thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
I want to kick off this podcast. One of the things we do almost all the time is talk about context, but I think I want to get into context a little bit later because you have so many nuances to your particular growing context since you grow in two different locations. Where I want to start with you is just with passion and fifth generation farmer. You don't hear that today anymore. Like that's very rooted. Talk to me about growing up with that. Was there pressure? Is that what started the passion for farming? Talk to me a little bit about that.
I almost feel like it was the opposite for me because I actually didn't grow up with that pressure. So my dad was actually the first generation to leave the farm. So he knew he didn't want to farm. So he went to Vietnam so that he could go to college on the GI Bill. And so he kind of grew up farming with his dad. But then once he hit 30, he was like, this isn't for me. So he actually left the farm. The farm has been our home farm, which is the one in Minnesota, which is our fifth generation. That one has been rented out to tenant farmers since the late 70s. And so, I think that growing up, I had a lot of knowledge about farming. We, of course, talked about the farm a lot. We went out there. All of our family still farms, but it wasn't that like pressure to, you have to take over the farm, you're the next generation. It was never really that. And so in a lot of ways, I think that kind of helps because you don't have quite that same level of like, number one, this is how we've always done it. And so that ingrained like inability maybe to think outside of the box agriculturally. And then also that just inherent pressure, like this is what your dad did and what his grandpa did. And so therefore you have to do it. So I think that allows that passion, I think, to take over a little bit more instead of the duty. Of course, I do feel that still, especially given the climate right now in terms of the market this year for commodity grains, it's pretty crazy. So there's of course pressure to, keep the farm in the family, make sure I'm not the first generation to like drop the ball and lose the farm. So there is still that pressure, but it's a different pressure. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't know. I think it's let me come at it a little bit differently.
Yeah, to kind of have a little bit more freedom rather than just all pressure to where you naturally want to rebel. In many ways, you're coming back to the roots of your lineage. And fortunately, the family farm didn't transition with your dad. They were able to keep it in the family.
Right. Yep. And that was always, that was always his goal, was to kind of keep that legacy going. He just wasn't really ever passionate about farming. Now he's kind of coming back to it. He's 80 this year. And so now that last year I came to him and I said, I really want to start taking a lot of the practices that I've been doing on my market farm here in Colorado. So we just have 2 acres. Of course, it's much smaller scale. Everything is different in terms of machinery and scales and quantities. But I wanted to take a lot of what I've learned and implemented with soil health practices and implement that on a large scale. So I came to him last year and I said, how much do you trust me? And so thankfully, he's softened a bit and is in his older years and is more willing to let me try some things. And so it's been a really fun adventure. And it's been great seeing him get, I think, back into that and kind of it's funny because a lot of the things we do now at that farm are things that he remembers doing with his grandpa growing up, but have been kind of phased out of agriculture and just haven't been done as much anymore. So it's been really fun kind of hearing him talk about like, oh yeah, I remember we used to do this, but now no one really
Hmm.
does it anymore, and now we're doing it again. So it's been fun.
Yeah. Well, let's backpedal a little bit. You have a farm in Colorado, and it's primarily a flower farm, or
Mhm.
has been for a while. What got you into this kind of micro market garden style farming, and specifically in flowers? And then, yeah, what started that?
Yeah, we found this property. I one of my closest friend passed away of suicide about 7 years ago, and I just felt like I needed something, a spark back in my life, and I was kind of flailing and not sure what I wanted to do, and but I'd always loved gardening and nature and being outside and soil, and so I found a property. We're just outside of the Denver metro, so it's just under 2 acres, and it's kind of a rare size of property for this area. And it was just overrun with weeds, and it was just terrible. But I saw something in it and took it as my opportunity to kind of just reignite a passion and a spark in myself. And flowers make a lot of sense on a small scale because they're pretty profitable. So when we're talking about, anywhere 1 to 2 acres, it's really hard to do more than an acre of flowers with one person just because the scale of planting, everything is done by hand, everything is harvested by hand. It's not like we're coming in here with a combine and harvesting the flowers. So it's pretty difficult to really scale up more than an acre or two without starting to hire a bunch of employees. So I just knew, okay, this is that the flowers were kind of profitability wise. And then also a big piece of what we do is ecosystem gardening, ecosystem focused farming. And so obviously with flowers, we're supporting a lot of pollinators. There's a lot of biodiversity benefits that come with flowers specifically. So big
Hmm.
focus on native plants and native flowers here at the farm.
Very cool. How did you market this? So you go from kind of feeling like you're flailing, as you described. What were you doing before this farm? Were you
Yeah.
in a different
Uh,
business, or?
yeah, I have my master's in business from UC Irvine. So I worked for Disney on their brand management team. I worked for Udi's, which is a gluten-free company. I worked for an engineering company, and I was a professional ballet dancer. And so I kind of juggled a few different weird jobs. And I think, business, I always joke that, I got my MBA and here I am farming. But, the marketing piece of that and the economics piece of that for sure is helpful when it comes to agriculture. Do I think that farmers need an MBA? No, but I do think it's helped a lot just with the marketing knowledge and kind of targeting my audience. And so I started there, kind of figuring out what are my strengths and weaknesses as a farm, and particularly with my location, with myself as a person, just that I like to teach and I like to educate. From there I kind of was able to figure out who my target market is, and from there I could also figure out, okay, well, how do I reach that target market, and then how do I most efficiently uh, sell to them. So what is it that I'm selling to that market? And so
Mhm.
I think putting all those things together, the business degree helped a lot.
Yeah, that's really an eclectic background. So working from Disney and a professional ballet dancer to now I'm a full-time flower farmer. Um, you describe yourself as flailing, but those are like swimming in really different oceans.
Yes. I guess emotionally flailing more than, more than
And like those are
professional.
just like you have to be really good at what you do to work at any of those things. Professional ballet, very strenuous, hard work, businesses that,
Yeah.
wow, my mind's blown. I didn't know that about you. I love it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
I'm a Virgo, so we're kind of we're kind of like perfectionist
I
people. There's pros and cons.
love it. I love it. So you started Blossom and Branch about 8 years ago, and you've got this 2 acre piece of garden, and you put together a plan. You said, I'm gonna sell flowers. I'm gonna find my market. Had you and And you said that this was a hobby beforehand. Describe to me your garden before you went all in garden. Um, was that
Yeah,
like a
I mean, I
home
think it
garden
was,
with a few raised beds or?
yeah, pretty typical home garden, I'd say. I mean, depending on the house we were at, growing up, I had just a small, my mom would always give me a little corner of her garden. And then my last two houses, I had just a raised bed. And I always just do wooden raised beds, like a 4x8. I think maybe my biggest garden was 8x8 before I moved here. Of course, I had
Mm-hmm.
landscape plants, but not on this scale. So it was a big leap for
Mm,
sure. I started small. I think my first patch, my first year was maybe 40 feet by 40 feet. It wasn't like I all of a sudden jumped in and I did the whole acre and a half of flowers. We expanded a little bit every year, and I would like, okay, clear a spot. And then for the next year, it would be ready to go. And then gradually work my way around that way.
uh-huh.
So it wasn't such a big leap all at once. Because I think if I had done that, it would have been pretty detrimental just because, as you get better at this, you learn efficiency and you learn kind of, okay, here was the wrong way to do it. and here's a more productive way to
Uh-huh.
do it. So a little bit at a time was helpful with scaling.
That's interesting because I think a lot of people who jump into market farming or small scale agriculture, they do the opposite in garden. They go from zero and they're like, I'm going to plant 3 acres of tomatoes and they're going to have, well, this is my story, right? Like, I'm going to have 3,000 tomato vines and we're going to grind. And it's like,
Who would do that?
whoa. And then now I was like, man, I could make way more money with way less stress by being a lot more intentional and focused. But again, it depends on when you started, like in what the influencing factors were. When I first started growing, I didn't have the education online.
Yeah.
Instagram wasn't a thing. Like Facebook was just becoming a thing. There wasn't books out there like The Market Gardener or anything. So it's really I'm trying to figure out the design element to where you're like, no, let's start small and scale up rather than the entrepreneurial side or the people that go the other way as they focus down.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and both are legitimate, right?
what
I
do you
mean,
think that was in yeah,
the reason that I did it
go
mostly was
ahead.
because I had kids, I had young kids. So when I started the farm,
Mm,
I had an infant. She was 2 months old, and I had a toddler who was two. So I just knew for myself, like
mm,
time wise, I was limited on time. And then as they get older, I don't want to say they're less work, but the work is different. And I can leave them a
uh-huh.
little bit more to themselves than I used to be able to. So that's been helpful. And then I think it also just varies year to year. Some years personally, I'm like, I'm taking this market out. So this year, for example, because we've been toggling back and forth between my Colorado farm and the Minnesota farm, I stopped doing weddings this year, for example, because I just knew the weddings are, I was terrified. My fear is always that like I have a wedding order and I forget it. And this is like someone's biggest day of their life
Mm,
and they show up and I'm like, I don't have your flowers. It's a nightmare that I have. So I just kind of took that off my plate for this year. So, I think just with farming, just like gardening, every year you kind of look at it and you say, okay, maybe this year I didn't like doing that, or this wasn't worth it for me, or wasn't profitable from a farming perspective. And you just adjust for the next year. And that's helpful, I think, with burnout. Burnout is so common. And I'm not immune to it for sure, but it does help to kind of just have a realistic, look at everything each year and what makes sense.
yeah. I think a few weeks ago you had a video that came out that did pretty well on your YouTube channel that was talking about where I'm at, I think was the title.
Yeah,
And
I think
you
of it.
kind of
Yeah, what am I
highlighted
doing
at some of
here?
those things of burnout.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
what am I doing here?
What am I
The
doing
question
here?
that all small farmers ask.
All small
So,
farmers, all
can you
big
kind of
gardeners.
recap?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really. I've heard it a lot from market farmers who hit I want to say like year 5, year 6 is when it kind of seems to hit a lot of people, because this that like rush of that early success and the excitement, it kind of starts to wane a little bit, I think. And you
Mm,
hit this like just like with any job, right? I mean, just like anything, you get to that point where not that it feels mundane, but it's not as exciting as it was in the beginning. And July and August and the heat is so intense. And then this year, just there's been so many struggles, with pricing and unknowns on material sourcing and unknowns on, for our home farm, like, okay, where are we going to be selling our corn? How much is the corn going to sell for? And I think all of that stuff that a farmer has to carry kind of in the back of their minds on top of like growing and marketing and selling, it's just a lot. And I think it's very common to see that burnout happen, starting in year 5, 6. And so that's been happening for me this year for sure. So I've just
Mm-hmm.
tried to be very mindful of myself and my energy and knowing that I'm veering toward that burnout. And our community has been great. I mean, we've started doing kind of community weeding nights. So, I think we've talked about this before, but like we can't really have volunteers. And I know a lot of farms do it, but just because we have so many followers, we're very public. And so I can't do a lot of things that maybe some smaller farms can, like have volunteers because federally we're not legally allowed to. So we've kind of figured out a way around that, which is to do a workshop. So I do a workshop for our community. We bring in 10 or 15 people. I teach a little mini class on something. And then, we do like a weeding course and then they all can go out and we give them each section and we weed and they can ask me questions as they're going. And so it's workshop focused, but I'm still also getting help at the same time. And I
Uh-huh.
think we charge like $5 for that workshop, yes, just so that we're not taking volunteers. So that's one way that our community has really stepped up to help. And then I've just toggled a lot to UPIC. So that's been really helpful for me because previously, when we're doing markets, I'm having to harvest everything on, Thursday night. And then Friday night, we arrange everything. Saturday morning, we have market. So it's kind of the whole weekend. And it's just a lot of work for us. And people have been loving doing UPIC. So instead, we tell people bring your jar. We provide clippers. We usually have, little refreshments out. They like being at the farm. They like the experience of being able to cut themselves. Not that it's like hands off, because of course we still have to go through the field. I have to make sure there's like no trip
Mm-hmm.
hazards. We're still having to deadhead stuff and make sure that like after the U-pick people come through, we come through and make sure like everything was cut the right way. Maybe we have to recut some things so that the next stems are still longer. So it's not hands off, but it's definitely much less work than doing a market was. So again, it's just kind of toggling, I think, each year, like what's going on, from a market perspective, personal perspective, and then still trying to make money. Of course, I have a book coming out in January. So, we've been
Mm-hmm.
running through like the 8 million final rounds of editing that comes with publishing a book. And so that's been a piece of all of this too. Yeah, it's just been a ride. My sister passed away last year. I think we talked about this last spring, but so helping my parents with all of that, and it's just we all have lives outside of our jobs, and I wish that everyone's economic circumstance was such that everyone was able to take time to heal and grieve and like rest when they need to. It's just not always the reality.
Mm.
So I don't know. I'm looking forward to December because December is my month. That's like the farm rest month, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, Thanksgiving to December is the great time. And until you're in your shoes and you get invited to 6 or 7 different conferences to speak or whatever
Like, no, I just wanted
there,
to.
and you say yes to them.
No, that's what
Yeah,
you have to say.
yeah,
No.
awesome. So let's talk about your growing context, because very few people are in the elevation that you're at. So you're located just outside of Denver, which is known as the Mile High City, right? It's your elevation is,
Yeah,
just at a
5,300.
mile high. So
Yeah, yeah.
so what are the nuances of growing there as a like let's talk about just your context. Frost, freeze, when things really get kicking off, your high temps, your low temps, what are the biggest challenges you face? Just describe your context to everyone.
Yeah, we always say with Colorado, like if you can garden here, you can garden anywhere. because it is very
Mm.
challenging with the elevation with our because of our proximity to the Rockies, we get very extreme temperature fluctuations. So depending on which way the wind is coming, if we get a Chinook wind coming over the Rockies, we can have a 90-degree temperature swing. There was one day a couple Septembers ago, and I remember it was early September and we were harvesting dahlias. It was 90 degrees that day. And the next day we were supposed to get snow. And we had all of our fabric out. I was trying to hoop everything, but of course the dahlias that time of year are like 5 feet tall. So we're trying to hoop and cover these dahlias because we usually don't get last frost or first frost until mid-October. So we still had another 6 weeks of growing season that should be frost free, but we were getting this random snow. So things like that will happen. Typically that happens more in the spring than it does in the fall. But again, it just depends on what's going on. Usually
Mm.
our first frost mid-October, last frost is mid-May. Of course, that fluctuates a little bit every year. And we're technically zone 5, 6. So, we'll get negative double-digit temperatures in the winter. But usually pretty decent snowfall, but it melts pretty quickly because of our elevation. And we get a lot of hail. So hail is the other challenge that we tend to see here quite a bit. And it's just I think we had our first hailstorm this year in April, and we can get hailstorms in September. So it's pretty much a season long hail concern, which, I
Mm.
think is fairly true everywhere. But again, it's just these mountains make everything a little bit funky.
So I know for vegetable growers, that's going to be a huge challenge, and obviously the blooms are going to take a hit.
Hmm.
Um, Overall, do you see an advantage to growing flowers over growing vegetables in this particular growing zone?
I mean, yes, certain flowers will rebound faster if we do see damage. And there's a lot more flowers, I would say, that I found over the years that we can grow that are frost tolerant. And so that's very
Mm.
helpful. Of course, if we have errant temperatures in the spring that are up and down, then as long as we're growing things that are frost tolerant and are properly hardened off, the odds of them surviving are better than, for example, tomatoes or zucchinis or, there's always those frost sensitive flowers too, but they tend to bloom
Mm-hmm.
faster. So if I direct sow, for example, a zinnia, which is frost sensitive, it's going to bloom within 90 days, probably a little bit sooner, usually 60 to 90, versus like a tomato is going to take a little bit longer in my zone to direct sow. So the blooms tend to come a little bit faster. And then again, we just found a wider range of things that are frost tolerant, but will also still continue to grow into midsummer. I think there's tons of frost tolerant things. Of course, you can do vegetable wise as well. But if we do get hail, the flowers will kind of get a pinch usually. If it's early enough in the season,
Mm-hmm.
it'll serve as kind of a pinch, and then they'll branch at least. So at the right time, a hail can be kind of helpful. But if it's
Mm.
later in the season, yeah, the flowers will for sure take a hit. And of course, because what we sell is so aesthetic. It's a visual product. We can't really sell blemished flowers that much, like you maybe could of
Mm.
blemished produce.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually that price gets knocked down on produce because so many people are preconditioned and trained to want
Right.
perfect
Has
produce.
to be perfect. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think yeah, even companies like Misfit Market, that have made their whole thing of, hey, we're going to be really low price because the produce doesn't look perfect.
Right.
Um, so interesting. Talk to me about your top 5 flowers. You mentioned zinnias. What else
Hmm.
are you growing that you found to be really hardy and beneficial for market and ease of growth potentially or profitability?
Yeah, that's tough. We've really branched out so much into so many native perennials because they're just so much less work compared to something I have to replant every year, which is a major advantage, in my opinion, of flowers versus produce. Is there's not a ton of perennial produce. Of course, there's things like berry plants and stuff like that, and apples and orchards and things like that. But there's a lot more options in terms of perennial flowers than there are perennial produce.
Mm,
So we do, peonies are probably our my one of my favorites because they're so low maintenance.
mm,
And they bloom at a time where it's before our pests have really come out for the year. So they're blooming in early spring. It's usually when people are really flower hungry. So they tend to start blooming kind of depending on zone and peony. Sometimes they'll bloom for Mother's Day, which is always the market
Mm.
that we want to try to capture. Doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah.
And then into early June, and then which is very popular for weddings. So July and August are less popular for weddings than June. So the peonies are great because profitability wise for weddings, they're huge. They're a favorite of everybody's. Again, low maintenance. I don't really have to do much in terms of watering, in terms of fertilizing. I do one spring nitrogen application. And then we just cut them down in the fall, and that's pretty much it. They come back on their own, you know. So anything I don't have to replant is great. So I'd say
Mm.
peonies. Yes, zinnias for ease of sowing, just so we can direct sow. Anything I can direct sow, and I don't have to do in a greenhouse and transplant saves me a lot of work. Of course, we're in Colorado, so dry climate, which is good for zinnias. They're actually native to my zone. More humid climates, usually succession planting would be helpful. We can get almost a
Hmm.
whole season of zinnias. So I'll usually do one succession direct sowing in like early July. So my
Hmm.
first one I'll do early June, second one early July, about a month later, and then we get blooms all season. And so those are the first two. I mean, Lysianthus will always have a special place in my heart, but of course they're very difficult for the average home gardener because 8 months from seed to bloom. But the vase life on them is absolutely unbeatable. And in terms of sales, I can always get people in if they know I have Lysianthus. So,
Interesting. So they're a sought after higher. Uh, how much do you charge per bloom on that? Is it a high margin bloom?
so it depends. So it depends on the type. It depends on what the blooms look like. So in hotter temperatures, Lysianthus have fewer petals. So it
Hmm.
kind of depends on what the season has looked like. If it's been a cooler season, then we'll usually get more roughly blooms and then we can charge more. So anywhere from $2 on the low end per stem and up to $4 if they're very, very full, which sometimes we'll have, you know, 5 or 6 blooms on one head. Especially for weddings, we can charge more. And they do really well out of water. So they're one that we can use for like corsages and boutonnieres and things like
Mm.
that, which is difficult to find in a flower. I hate having to like water pick and do all of that stuff for like personal items for weddings is a big pain. So the more they just hold out of water on their own, the better.
Hmm.
So yes, yeah, we can really, and just I think because I've pushed them so much personally, I'm always showing them. Anytime I tell my customers like the Lysianthus are in, it'll sell out of you pick overnight, just
Mm.
for those.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. I want to talk a little bit because I've talked to you about this in the past. You have taken some very, very strong stances against plastic, which is a, a a cool thing, but I've seen the internet go mad on it. Um, talk
Yeah.
talk to me about kind of that drive and that push and where you're leaning, and you've shifted your name to regenerative gardening. And what does that actually mean, and how do you define regenerative?
Yeah.
Let's go there.
Yeah, it's the internet. You know, the internet. It's so hard because like everything becomes an extreme. But yes, regenerative gardening to me is it's basically what regenerative agriculture is, which is rebuilding soil, building topsoil, sequestering carbon in the ground, incorporating natural processes and systems like incorporating animals if possible.
Uh-huh.
And to me, it's generally reducing reliance on inputs. So outside inputs, synthetic fertilizers, fungicides, things of that nature. Trying to minimize that by instead leaning on what we know about the way that nature grows, and what we've learned, from a lot of indigenous cultures. That's to me, everyone has their own definition, but that's to
Hmm.
me what it is. And yeah, plastic free is a big part of that, just because, in my opinion, if we're trying to regenerate the soil, a lot of that has, again, carbon sequestration. A lot of it is fundamentally tied to, the health of our planet. And in my personal opinion, just the more plastic that is involved in that process, the less benefits we're getting out of it from a regenerative standpoint. And agriculture is it's a pretty big offender in terms of single use plastic. garden
Mm.
industries as well. There's just a lot of plastic pots, plastic starters, all of our seedling trays, landscape mulch, plastic landscape mulch, which I know, it's again, people tend to be like, oh my gosh, you hate. I have tons of followers who use plastic landscape fabric. I used it. I used to use it. And that's why I think that also informs a lot of where I come from now because I did use it for years and I've also not used it for years. So I kind of have a good side by side of what my soil looks like in both systems. Um, so I'm not just speaking from this like very fundamentalist view of like no plastic. It's really I've done both and I've seen some of the side effects. So but the internet just tends to get all up in arms about like oh you said this and so therefore you hate like no there are always going to be times and places where you have to use what you have to use and there are ways, of course, to do it in a way that is better. Reusing that fabric as long as you can. Of course, reusing your seed trays as long as you can. But in general, I do like to just show alternatives because I think the more people can see, like, okay, there is someone who is scaling this.
Hmm.
Because doing it at home is one thing, for someone to do this in their backyard 4x8 raised bed is totally different than doing it on a 3-acre farm.
Hmm. I want to. One of the interesting things in the arguments on the West Coast,
Mhm.
in particular for plastic mulch, as we zoom in on single use plastics, is the water retention and the water holding capacity of that mulch over that soil substrate because it does hold in a significant portion of water.
Mhm.
Um, let's Do you have any data or can you juxtapose the two different alternatives with other techniques that you're learning or working through?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't have data per se, but I do have my own experience. And of course, we're a very dry climate too. I think our average rainfall here in Denver is 8 inches a year.
Hmm.
So yeah, pretty arid. So that was one of the big arguments that we also heard. And in fact, when I used to use it, I would even have to layer straw on top because the heat that would be generated would actually dry out and crack the soil. So obviously later in the season, that's not as big of a deal once things are a little bit larger. But when the seedlings were
Hmm.
still small, we would have issues with it. So, or if a little seedling was touching the edge of the hole that we'd burned for it, then it would heat it up or it would burn that seedling. We've certainly seen that. I'm sure you have too. So what we transitioned to was just mulches, organic mulches. So depending on what the crop is, we'll use different mulches, and it also depends on what I have on hand. I often have a lot of leaves. We do a leaf donation program with our neighborhood. So we put it on next door. People bag their leaves, they bring them to us. I tell them, they have very strict limits. So I check every bag when they're dropping them off. I make sure there's no branches and twigs in there. We make sure that we say, okay, no treated leaves from any trees that have been treated with pesticides. So that's one that I'll use a lot. We'll also use pine needle mulch if I can get my hands on pine needle straw. It's one of my favorite mulches because it doesn't blow away like straw does. We don't have to worry
Hmm.
about seeds germinating like we do with straw. And it holds a really nice mat. So it's a great mulch and it lasts for 2 or 3 seasons. So it's a little bit higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than, for example, leaves are, which means it'll last a little bit longer. Pros and cons of that again, depending on the crop. For perennials, wood chips are pretty much my go-to. So, there are downsides of that, of course. I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, it's just as easy as rolling out, for a peony farmer to say, you can roll out your landscape mulch and pretty much leave it for 10 years and not have to reapply mulch. That's not the case for us. With wood chip mulch, even if I do it thickly, I'm still having to reapply it, every 3 years or so. So it depends on what, I'm looking for. I want to find like a better mulcher for my scale. There's great ones for like big scale, but I need like a little scale mulch spreader. That would help us out a lot. But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it's less work, but the soil benefits that we see are huge. And so that's where I say like the befores and afters. We still have actually landscape fabric on one row of our peonies, but they just haven't gotten to it. And when I pull it up, in the fall, it's just the soil underneath is cracked. There's no organic matter. So that's kind of the downside to me is that, with the mulches that we use, with organic matter mulches, those are breaking down into the
Mm-hmm.
soil, which is creating soil for the food web, which is reducing how much I'm having to apply in terms of fertilizer. That doesn't happen with the landscape mulch just because it's a barrier all year. We might put something down in the fall, but the amount of organic matter breakdown that we get in the fall and winter
Uh-huh.
is very low because the temperatures are low.
Uh,
Compared to in the summer, if we have organic matter and moisture happening, we get a lot of breakdown, incorporation of that organic matter down and into the soil. Therefore, we have feeding of the soil food web and mineralization of the nutrients. So we're just having to apply less.
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So it saves, it's like a pro and con. Like I'm saving money. I really do feel like I'm saving money not using it. It is a little bit more work. The more we're dialing it in, the better it's getting.
Right. What kind of weed pressure did you have? I know in most market garden settings, initially there's a significant high level of weed pressure, and you were fighting that with plastic mulches in your early
Yes.
years. Um, Talk about your specific weed pressure.
Yeah, and that's where again, like there is nuance to this conversation, right? I mean, there are growers who experience incredibly high rates of weed pressure, especially early on. And, if the argument, of course, is always like, well, what's better, microplastic breakdown into your soil or herbicide contamination? And that really, I feel like, is up to the individual grower to research and make that decision on. We had a lot of weed pressure. We had a lot of bindweed. We had a lot of Canadian thistle. We had poison hemlock. We had some really nasty ones, and
Uh-huh.
and it was very overgrown. So we still get that, and our neighborhood, unfortunately, is a lot of large lots, but not people with a lot of money to manage it. So
Uh,
there's a lot of weeds that still blow in. Even if I keep my lot maintained, the people next door just aren't able to, and so we get a lot of it. Just is ongoing. So the more mulch I can keep down, the easier it is. But yeah, over the years, as we just kind of figured out how to deal with each weed individually, it's gotten better.
gotcha. What are your strategies for some of those specific weeds in general, like bindweed?
Yeah, so it really depends on the weed. I do have people want to watch. We have a video on YouTube where we specifically go into like weed control for various weeds, not super drilled down, but talking kind of about this.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I will say that a lot of my weed strategy now is informed by my conversations with Dr. Talamy, who's nobody's read his books before. They're phenomenal. He wrote one called Nature's Best Hope that's really informed a lot of our like native plantings and biodiversity strategies. And his, that he really turned me around. So for the first three years, I was very, very staunchly anti-herbicide. I will never apply these things. I will never use them. And I was quite frankly getting nowhere with mostly the honeysuckles. We had buckthorn, we had Siberian elms, which when I cut them, I would cut them down and then that would just trigger them to sucker and spread. And so that's a case where I say it's very important to know what weed you're dealing with because if it's a native weed and it's just a nuisance weed, or it's like dandelions. Okay, whatever. No big deal. We can deal with that. We can hand dig those out.
Uh-huh.
Those I just usually manually deal with. For things that are qualified as noxious invasive weeds, so that for our climate, bindweed falls under that. We tried a few different things. We tried the bindweed mites. They did not work because they'll only work if you have unirrigated pasture. And of course, we're watering our flowers. So when you're watering bindweed, it just
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
And if you've never had bindweed, right, you don't know what it's like. But it climbs corn. It would climb our corn. It would climb our sunflower and just pull them down. So the first 3 years, I was just, and then I got to the point where I almost quit because even with the plastic, it was coming up in between and through the holes, and I was just like, it was just a nightmare. So finally, I talked to Dr. Talamy, and he was like, listen, he also has a big property. He has several acres that they are dealing with the same issues. And he said, we've just learned that there are certain noxious invasives that you have to do the cut and paint method with, where they will cut. the weed or the tree at the root, and then they'll take a paintbrush, they'll dip their paintbrush in their herbicide, and they'll dab it onto the cut end. And and that's the only thing that will kill a lot of the stuff. So Japanese knotweed, for example, tree of
Hmm.
heaven is another one that we have spreading in our neighborhood. So we've just learned that we have to do that cut and paint method, and so that works really well with bindweed, depending on the time of year. So it's really important anytime, and I don't just like blanket recommend. I always say talk to your state extension service because they'll know what the weed is. They'll also be able to tell you when you should be doing this because it's not just like you shouldn't just be spraying all year. Specifically
Hmm.
with bindweed, it's taking down nutrients in the fall, and that's when it's putting it down and into the taproot, which can be like 16, 20 feet deep, right? Which is why you can't pull out bindweed. It'll just regrow. So if you apply, and we take a little paintbrush, what I do is I dip it in and I brush it onto the leaves here in about October. And that's when it's taking nutrients down and into the taproot. So if
Hmm.
you can use the appropriate herbicide, paint it on so you're not contaminating surrounding soil. And then it just takes it down directly. And that's been the best option that I've found. So it's the reality of like, right, we can sit here in armchair farm and it's the same thing for like any
Mm.
industry, of course, where we can sit here and say, well, from my perspective, here's what you should do.
Mm.
And yes, totally agree that like from an outside perspective, we should be able to manage these things without herbicide. But the reality
Hmm.
is that these are not native plants. They are noxious invasives. So they're not native to our area, which means they can come in and choke out everything else, including all those natives that we've been planting to try to feed our ecosystem. So I think of it like chemotherapy, it's like it's a one-time treatment. And if we can do it and knock it out, and that means that I can plant a field of goldenrod that's gonna feed bumblebees, then to me that's a better option.
Yeah, that's it's a good perspective of, sometimes I love the term you said, armchair farmer, I think is what you said, but
Yeah.
it we see the armchair growers that only have a very small perspective on their own context and what
Hmm.
can work or won't work or theoretically could work but may not work. And I think that's one of the heartbeats of this podcast is how do you grow what you grow and what challenges do you face in your context, and narrowing that focus in to say, hey, eh, Florida is not Colorado, which is not California, which is not Missouri. Wherever your state is or wherever you're at, it is different. There are different challenges and pressures there. I
Yeah, and I
think.
think context is such an important one too with regenerative, anything regenerative agriculture, regenerative gardening, context should always be part of that conversation.
Hmm. Now we've got we some time left. We've talked kind of across this whole thing, and we've zoomed into some flowers, and we've pulled back out, and you're applying these regenerative gardening techniques into larger scale agriculture now. You're one of the few people that are um, maybe moving in that direction. I guess as a whole, regenerative still hasn't taken off mainstream, but specifically from flower farming in Colorado to Minnesota grain farming, very different. What are some of the practices that you're trying to do, and what are the results that you've seen this year um, through those practices?
Yeah, it's been really exciting. And one of the reasons that I did this was because I kept hearing, whenever of course, we do a lot of social media and, whenever I would post anything, people love to say, oh, well, that works for you on your scale, but it would never work on XYZ scale. So
Hmm.
of course that's always the challenge. And the other challenge that farmers are facing that is so different than what a home gardener is facing is the reality of profitability. So of course, the joke is always like a home gardener, like, oh, here's my tomato that costs $200 to grow,
Hmm.
right? Because of the bed and the soil and all of this stuff.
Hmm.
Well, for a farmer, that'll put them under, that'll make them lose the farm if they're not being so specific with their costs. So we are being very careful in tracking all of our expenses because we need to know that at the end of the day, this is profitable. Because
Hmm.
if it's not profitable, no one is going to do it. And that's just the reality. So again, we run into this armchair farmer thing. There's regenerative agriculture has a huge movement behind it, but most people behind it, unfortunately, are not actually farmers. It's a lot of activists, which is great. You know, I love having that momentum, but the problem is they get very, very into the weeds on a lot of this stuff. Like, oh, well, you shouldn't be using herbicide, but it's like, okay, well, sometimes the only way that a regenerative farmer can terminate a rye cover crop, for example, is going to be either with herbicide or with tillage. Well, they don't want anyone to till, they want everybody to be no-till. You know, you can always crimp a rye cover crop, but that's only if it's at the right stage of growth. You can't just crimp it at any stage. So, you know, for a lot of farmers, that means, okay, they're putting off planting then for a month. And then again, that's eating into their profit. So if they can't make money on it, they're not going to do it. So I wanted to try it because I was like, okay, I can't talk a big talk like, or talk about this at all. I didn't feel like I could without having hands on the ground, boots on the ground knowledge.
Mm.
So yeah, we've been doing, you know, we kind of jumped all in. I went non-GMO corn, which for that area, you know, we're surrounded by GMO corn. So of course our neighbor farmer is like, because they have to be very careful with drift from their herbicides. So ours are not Roundup ready. So if they get hit by Roundup, then they're toast. So we started with non-GMO corn, doing a lot of inoculants. So we're working with Advancing Eco Agriculture, which is John Kemp's company, and inoculating seeds. So when I talked about my dad and remembering things they used to do, he remembers when they would take their seed sifter and they would inoculate their seeds. And we're doing that again. So you you know, various mycorrhiza, azospirillum is one that we use for the corn. So trying to uh, get those inoculants right onto the seed right from germination so that as soon as they germinated, they were able to start fixating nitrogen. So we're trying to, of course, lower nitrogen rates. We didn't do any herbicide passes, and it was a very wet year, and we skipped all the fungicide too. So totally herbicide free, totally fungicide free, non-GMO, and then we doubled our spacing. So typical corn crop is 30-inch spacing. We decided to try 60 because the theory that I'm trying is that we want to get a cover crop in between. So of course, trying to get this regenerative soil health, organic matter, no herbicide, we needed something covering the soil. So if we do a double spacing on the corn, that means more sunlight's getting down to the soil. That means we can get our cover crop growing during the growing season. We're normally in that zone up in Minnesota, you know, you have a very limited window to cover crop if you're doing it after harvest. Like you're talking about basically frost, you know, the growth you get is very small. So trying to get growth on the cover crop during the growing season by widening the rows. And then also what we found is that, which has been really interesting, on the 60-inch rows of corn, there's more sunlight getting down to all of those leaves. So there's better photosynthesis happening. And there's also less fungus pressure because of the
Airflow.
increased circulation. So far, I mean, we haven't harvested yet, of course. So I'm like, I hesitate to say like it's been a big success. Of course, it's been a good corn year for everybody in the US. We have a record corn crop this year, which is good and bad prices, but it looks really good. We've just been doing all inoculant based. So we did a big manganese treatment like back right when it was tasseling. And we've also been doing sap analysis. So versus soil testing, where, you know, we test the soil. Of course, we did do a Haney test in the fall just to see what everything looked like. But we've been actually taking samples of the plant leaves themselves, and we send them to the Netherlands and they analyze them for sugars and all of the micro and macronutrients. And then they tell us exactly what needs to be applied. So it's been a very, very targeted micronutrient program. So we've been very, very specific with what we need and interestingly, what we don't need. So we've actually probably been applying a lot less than a lot of the neighboring farmers just because it's been so targeted. So the hope is that it's going to save money again. We'll see when the yields come out. I mean, to me, it's looking pretty good. But the proof is in the bushels. So
Is this all dry farming?
it is, yeah. I mean, it's Minnesota, so they get quite a bit of natural rainfall. But no, it's not irrigated.
Right. So yeah. So for those who don't know that are listening, you know, there you have irrigated farming and you've got what they call dry farming, which is basically after they plant, they don't have irrigation on that field, and it's solely reliant on water from the sky. You know, sometimes stuff falls from the sky. here in Arizona, we don't know what that is. We just it, it we hear that in places they get water that just falls from the sky, but we don't have it here. Um, but yeah, they try to get a crop off of no irrigation, and so that's how the majority of the Midwest corn acres actually work. Um, it's becoming less and less that as people are putting in more pivots across the nation, but that's how it used to, how everyone used to farm back in
Mhm.
the day, how everyone did.
Yep.
So you have probably half the seed count um, going in on these acres, or did you increase the in-row
We increased the
spacing?
import, yeah. So we kept about the same population in the 60-inch rows and the 30. We did both also to be kind of side by side.
Hmm.
Uh, but we kept the population almost the same. So it's double space. It's like, yeah, the rows in themselves have twice the population, and then in between it's a double wide. So it's about the same. So we'll see.
So when you've gone and pulled plants this summer, how did the root nodules look and growth rates and all that?
Everything's looked really good. We've done aerial drone shots,
Hmm.
and when we compare our farms to the neighboring farms, our corn is greener. It was planted a little bit later, so it's a little hard to compare
Hmm.
side by side. Because we did a non-fungicide treated seed, we had to plant a little bit later because
Hmm.
with the fungicides, that helps them be able to get the corn in the ground earlier. Just when it's cool and wet, that's when that fungus thrives. So, there's it's not quite apples to apples. I am confident that we'll get at least 180 bushels per acre,
Hmm.
which is pretty good. A little under 200 is the average for that area. Some spots will get up to 220. So, that at the end of the day, it all
What
comes down
what
to the coffee shop talk.
Yeah. Well, you hear those numbers and to many people it doesn't mean anything, but the question becomes, okay, well, what were the inputs? How
Exactly.
much were you spending on to get these bushels per acre?
Right.
And
And the hope is that the regenerative processes, so of course, we had to add a few things this year because the inoculant costs,
Mhm.
those kinds of things where on a home garden scale, when I'm teaching home gardeners this, I'm like, okay, go out to your compost pile, grab a scoop of your good homemade compost, rub that on your seeds. There's your inoculant. You can't really do that, farm scale. We don't have a compost pile out there. It's just, maybe one day we will. But so yeah, we had to buy that stuff in. But the theory is that if we keep these practices going, if we keep armor on the soil through a cover crop, if we keep doing things like minimizing our fungicides, which is one of the big hits for soil life is fungicide. It just, it wipes out a lot of the soil fungus. So the more we can keep that stuff in the soil that now we've put in, the less we'll have to do each year. So
Mm.
while years 1, 2, and 3, we're having to add a lot of these inoculants, in theory, that should not be a forever thing. Once we have the system up and going, we're letting nature take the lead and letting that organic matter be kind of the bulk of the fertilizer and the biodiversity that we're hopefully going to be bringing in. That's going to help with the disease and the pests and all that stuff. So it's going to be a little bit, we know the input is going to be a little bit higher in the beginning,
Mhm.
and then hopefully it'll taper off. So it's a 3-year experiment. We're on year 1 now. It's just not a 1-year thing.
Mm.
Um, but we'll see. Yeah, again, the corn prices this year are going to be fun. So, and the soybean prices. So
Yeah.
it's a
So
tough spot.
which cover crop selection did you use through the summer months of growing season? And then what is going to be your transitionary practice moving? Are you shifting to a winter cover with living green cover? Are you leaving that residue and are going to drill it next year? And
Yeah.
a similar thing.
So
What does that look like?
we did a mix of cover crop seed. I think it was actually, I think we had 12 species on there. So things like we had flax in there. We had some crimson clover. We had buckwheat. Gosh, I'd have to go through and list them all. But we also had some that should overwinter. So in theory, we got some growth and some flowering in the summer from those crops, and then we'll get a little bit of overwintering. What I would love to experiment with, because it would make farmers would love it if we could do a 60-inch row, do the cover crop in between the corn, and then the next year actually do corn on corn, drill it into the
The
row where the
opposite.
cover crop was. Yeah, because corn is just a more profitable crop generally. So we'll see. I would like to try that at one point. But ideally, we're getting a little bit of overwintering on this cover crop that we have growing now. we'll leave that residue in place. And then, yeah, we no-till drill next year. The plan is to do soybeans next year. And again, all inoculant based
Hmm.
amendments there. So, yeah, we'll see. It's,
Gotcha. So even some of the things that you planted there are pretty tall growing stuff, not necessarily compared to corn if you get
right.
the
And
height,
that's
but
just
they
it.
are rapid. I mean, buckwheat, rapid tall growth, you know.
Yep. So it's all about the stage, right? It's just like cover cropping in the garden. It's all about the timing. And so, yeah, it was the same for the farm. We had to really be, and now, of course, we're also dealing with like, we're not the ones planting it. I'm contracting people to plant that for
Mm,
me. And so I'm having to kind of go on their schedules. So yeah, you're wanting to plant a cover crop in amongst the corn at like B6 to B8 stage, which is when they have about 6 leaves. So it's once the corn's already started to take off. And then once it does, corn grows like an inch a day. So it's pretty crazy growth rate. So, but you don't want to plant them at the same time. And that's the same in the garden. Like I'll do dahlias with buckwheat, for example. And I have to make sure that I don't plant the buckwheat when I'm planting my dahlias, because then, yeah, the buckwheat will grow and totally choke out those dahlias. I wait
right,
until the dahlias are about a foot tall. Then I sow in that buckwheat. It grows up and under like a little canopy underneath.
right. And on that drilling, um, I'm imagining they have to make sure they're right at a height stage to where their machining can still get over it.
Right.
And if they're delayed on other things, what does that look like for your program?
Yeah, so that happened this year actually because yeah, our interceder that was supposed to go across just wasn't able to get in. They had a really wet spring, and that's one of the challenges that you run into with this scale of farming versus like my scale, right? I do stuff
Hmm.
by hand. So if it's wet, no big deal. I can still walk around in there. But if you're bringing in a huge machine, you don't want to be driving in your fields when it's super wet. So
Hmm.
we actually had to fly in our cover crop seed with drone this year.
Hmm.
And so we've been doing a lot of drone usage, which has been really cool. The technology of the drones is phenomenal. It's really crazy to watch just
Hmm.
how targeted they are, especially compared to things like, you know, air. They used to do all this stuff like with the little airplanes, little crop
Hmm.
dusters, even helicopters, but the drones are very, very targeted. I think they have a long way to go in terms of like battery life and how much
Hmm.
capacity they can carry, but we were able to get our cover crop in with the drone 15 acres, so that's pretty good.
Very cool. So how many acres total are you doing out there and what can you scale up to?
Yeah, I think it's about 16 that we're doing this year, and with the potential to scale up to 200.
Okay.
Yeah, and our tenant farmers do about 4,000 acres, so they're watching this really closely. We've been working with them pretty closely just because, we would all love for it to be, farmers do care about the soil, and I think a lot of farmers are the target often of a lot of wrath and anger
Hmm.
from people because it's easy to look at farming and say, oh, this is, the way you're doing this is wrong, or, we've been told you should be doing no till or whatever it is. And, but they really do care. They care about the soil. It's their biggest investment. So if
Hmm.
there's anything that we can do and we can show that it's better for the soil, that it is actually going to save the money in the long run, that it's not, prohibitive in terms of application, then they want to do it too.
Hmm.
So, in theory, we could scale it up a lot. There's still a long ways to go. It was terrifying actually this year. I went out there and there were no bees to be found anywhere. I mean, it
Hmm.
was shocking. There were some butterflies, but I mean, on my corn patch at home, you're at my market farm, it's like covered in bees. There's bees buzzing everywhere. Not a one, not a one. And that's what scares me with like, again, herbicide, there's a time and a place when we're talking about conservation, and mass application of herbicide and pesticide over millions of acres is really concerning, especially when go out there and it's like there's no pollinators. So that's something else I want to work on. Is putting our hedgerows back in, and it's something we need to do here in the U.S. We really need those
Hmm.
hedgerows back. They've just gotten rid of them because everyone has a 24 row planter now, so it's much easier for them to drive across the field if there's no hedgerow. Um, but the reality of that is erosion. We've lost a lot of our birds, a lot of our pollinators, and those do help with things like pests. So trying to
Hmm.
bring the biodiversity back that's my next year.
I love it. And you're not going to burn out doing that.
Sure.
and and it's not a big task.
No, no big
And
deal.
yeah, we'll solve all the
Right.
world's problems.
Right. The passion is there. The passion is there. And yeah, again, it's like talk. It's just as we all do. So we all just figure out, okay, where's something that I can take a little bit of energy from and like stop doing X so that I can do
Right,
Y.
right. Well, I know just from a personal standpoint, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your work and in the way that you've inspired so many on social media. And it is not an easy thing to put your life out there and have everyone spew venom and hate towards you in whatever direction. Um, and all of my conversations with, whoa, I'm not putting my thumbs down. Whoa,
Apples.
whoa, the internet is shaking. So for those that are just listening, I put up my thumb like as like a thumbs up and it came upside down like it was criticizing what I was
Wow.
saying. Wow.
Wow.
Man,
Being
I'm telling
judged
you,
now.
Big Brother's
Yeah.
always watching. So as I say thank you, Briana, for all that you've done, uh, it is a very challenging thing to do what you've done, not only in just farming and growing, but putting your life out there and standing for something. And I just want to say thank you for that. And
Yes, look,
it's a hard thing. So
I appreciate it.
keep up the great work. For those who want to find out more about what you're up to and the techniques and things you're working towards, where do they find you?
Yep. Instagram is Blossom and Branch Farm. In fact, I think everywhere is Blossom and Branch Farm. And then, yeah, we have our book coming out in, I think, January 27th. It hits the shelves, and that is called The Regenerative Gardener's Handbook. And it is aimed at home gardeners in kind of applying all of this stuff and plastic-free methods on a home scale. And it gives all of our kind of tips and tricks and fun stuff in there with some good pictures. So
Yeah, that's going to be terrific. I am looking forward to picking up a copy of that myself. That's
I'll
going to be
sign
great.
your copy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Briana Bosch with Blossom and Branch. Are you still regenerative gardening on YouTube, or is that?
Yeah, I think it's like regenerative gardening with Blossom and Branch. So if you
Okay.
put in one of those and Brianna, it'll come up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I know you are a very, very busy person with 2 farms in multiple states and trying to keep humans alive and flowers alive and plants alive. Thank you so much for your time today. And we were definitely inspired and blessed. And I think I'm going to go and try something bigger now because you're inspirational.
Thanks, Luke. I appreciate it.
Awesome. And thanks for staying tuned all the way to the end. We're so excited that you're here, and that probably means that you enjoyed what you heard. You found some value in it. If you could, go and share this with somebody that you know that really helps push it forward in the algorithm. Hit a like, a subscribe, hit a review. It makes all the difference for us. Thank you for listening to the How I Grow This podcast, and we are dedicated to bringing more of these stories to you to help you grow at the next level. We'll see you.